At Making Medicine, we're reporting on the headlines, not making medical recommendations. For personal health questions, always consult a doctor. Nothing in this episode constitutes investment, financial, or legal advice, and please consult your own advisors before making decisions. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. This week, we're talking through the latest headlines, looking at the latest FDA approvals, and celebrating National Intellectual Property Month, or National IP Month, with special guest Joshua Kresh. With that, let's get into the show. And now for some headlines from the last week across the biotech industry. Most notably, we had our third announcement out of the White House with EMD Serono. But it was another element of that conversation that we're going to get into, and that's the announcement of the first priority review vouchers out of the FDA that have occurred since the Trump administration took office. They're wide-ranging, covering all sorts of priorities for the administration. So, in addition to EMD Serono's similar announcement to Pfizer and AstraZeneca, we thought we'd dive a little deeper. As discussed in an earlier episode, the Commissioner's PRV program was announced back in June to significantly shrink the review time for new drug applications, NDAs, and biologics license applications, or BLAs. FDA has shared that they'd like review times to go from roughly a year to only 1 to 2 months, and laid out a number of program criteria that aligned with the most important U.S. priorities. Those included addressing a U.S. public health crisis, delivering more innovative cures for the American people, addressing a large unmet medical need, onshoring drug development and manufacturing, and increasing affordability. So just from those 5 criteria alone, you can see this is a wide-ranging and frankly very subjective process. And so these first 10 announcements certainly give us a little look at what people are looking at. So for each of the following, each review decision was tasked with nominating a product that met program criteria. And here they are, the first PRV recipients. Pergoveris for infertility from Merck, teplizumab for type 1 diabetes from Sanofi, cytisinicline for nicotine vaping addiction from Achieve Life Science, DBOTO for deafness from Regeneron, from Dompe Pharmaceuticals for blindness, Synedgermin, their BKBJ variety, RMC 6236 from Revolution, which is focused on pancreatic cancer, for porphyria from Disc Medicine, bitoperin, ketamine, focused on domestic manufacturing, and Augmentin XR for domestic manufacturing from USA Antibiotics, and the ketamine will come from Flow. I want to focus on the last two for a moment because both of them reflect very commonly well-known drugs, but a priority for domestic manufacturing. Augmentin, something very familiar to folks who take antibiotics, and ketamine, which is used in general anesthesia, a focus on bringing both of them back to the U.S. We also saw a wide-ranging list of drugs being approved in places where we are looking for innovation. For example, pancreatic cancer, where for so many, it does not bring about the hope that many other cancers have seen in recent years. The FDA announced that another batch of recipients are expected in just a few months. Another headline that caught our eye this week is growing conversation around one of the real achievements in the One Big Beautiful Bill of the inclusion of the Orphan Cures Act, which does away with a maddening disincentive to find secondary indications for rare drugs. Study after study after study shows, both from the investor perspective as well as the entrepreneur and the patient perspective, that what works in one area of science stands a good chance of working in another. There are a litany of drugs whose secondary indications brought hopes to patients who had nothing to do with the first indication. But following the passage of the IRA, there was a big disincentive to pursuing that secondary indication. Right after the IRA, it was Alnylam who announced that they'd stop a phase 3 trial pretty far along simply because exploring a secondary indication made no economic sense. That noise has bubbled up, and Incubate's been one of the voices calling for this fix, and sure enough, the Orphan Cures Act is now law. But now we're beginning to hear a little bit of pushback. There's conversation that because some of the drugs that would have been slated for negotiation might now be exempt, are driving up the cost of the Orphan Cures Act over time. A recent CBO score that was issued earlier this week at the behest of a handful of Democrats pointed that the cost could be roughly double, from $4 billion to approximately $8 billion, because of the inclusion and impact on price negotiations of a handful of drugs in 2028. That's led some policymakers to run with the headline and introduce a bill effectively repealing the Orphan Cures Act. While this will continue to play out, it's important to remember that the Orphan Cures Act is not about now. It's about the future. And what's forgotten in the conversation from those pushing changes to the Orphan Cures Act, which is now law, is the fact that we have given certainty to investors and early stage entrepreneurs that pursuing secondary indications and letting science lead the way is the best course. Now, politically speaking, it makes a lot of sense that in these partisan environments, Democrats will be looking for any reason to poke holes in what was included in a Republican-only bill. But it's important to remember that the Orphan Cures Act and the rare disease advocacy that went into it led to bipartisan support to this issue. At the end of the day, the short-term budget horizon that the CBO looked at simply can't include the long-term benefits of having more medicines with more capabilities and proven science. That's why this became law in the first place. So there'll be more headlines about the impact of the Orphan Cures Act on a handful of already manufactured drugs, but here at Incubate and the Making Medicine podcast, we're focused on the positive impacts that are going to lead to new drugs and new treatments for patients. For more on tracking the beneficial progress, check out Incubate's Life Science Tracker and Rare Disease Tracker that is already capturing changed investor sentiment and a return to dollars for those looking for secondary indications for rare disease drugs. Each month, Incubate looks back on the Making Medicine podcast at the good news that's come out of the FDA. This is the Approvals Corner. This September, we saw 5 new approvals. Keytruda's QLEX from Merck was approved to treat adult and pediatric solid tumor indications. Forzinity from Stealth Biotherapeutics was approved to improve muscle strength in patients with Barth syndrome. Lilly had an approval for Inlure to treat certain breast cancers with disease progression following at least one line of endocrine therapy. Crinetics Pharmaceuticals saw approval for Palsonify, which treats acromegaly in adults who had an inadequate response or for whom surgery is not an option. And finally, Novartis's Rapsido was approved to treat chronic spontaneous urticaria in adults who remain symptomatic despite H1 antihistamine treatment. What I think is particularly compelling about a couple of these is they were advancements for folks who other treatments were not an option or not working as well as they could be. And so it's not always about finding a new drug for a disease state that doesn't have a therapy, but sometimes it's making sure that for folks existing therapies aren't working, new options are at the table. And that's what we got this month. As mentioned, October is National IP Month in the United States, where we celebrate the role intellectual property plays, not just in our economy, but in our everyday lives. Whether it's a movie you love, a book you read, a new device, computer, phone, or most importantly, the medicines we take, none of them would be possible without intellectual property. There are a lot of things to give the Founding Fathers credit for, and one of them is including intellectual property enshrined in the Constitution. So we're glad to have Joshua Kresh on in a moment to talk IP at a time when we're questioning some of those very foundations, but also seeing unparalleled innovation thanks to progress, all thanks to IP. In celebration for National IP Month, we're lucky to have one of IP's luminaries, Joshua Kresh, on the show. He's the research professor and executive director of IPPI, the IP Policy Institute with the University of Akron School of Law. He's previously been an associate with DLA Piper in DC, where he practiced patent litigation. He has a law degree with honors from George Washington University Law School, has a number of other degrees and honors I won't go into, but frankly is one of the most important voices in IP and doing incredible work at IPPI, which, Joshua, maybe that's the best place to start off. First, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John.
Tell us a little bit about the work of IPPI. What are you doing that's helping move IP protection forward in this country?
Sure. So IPPI is an IP institute at a U.S. law school that focuses on IP and innovation. So we basically study how the IP system is working in the real world, which differentiates us from a lot of other academics, because we do theory, but we really care about practice and seeing what's really happening, and does the theory follow with practice, which it doesn't always. And then we try to translate that into easier to understand tidbits that can be used by industry and by policymakers. If they make changes, they can make it based on reality versus based on what kind of, gut feelings, which sometimes influence things more than they should, particularly in this space.
Well, I'm sure we're going to get into some of the gut feelings of folks in the Trump administration or in Congress, but here we are for many of our listeners, they'll be very familiar with IP, but it always helps to restate it. Why, of all the industries you look across at IPPI, why is biotech so important? Why is it so intrinsic that we talk about IP as it relates to biotech and developing new medicines?
So developing a medicine is time consuming, takes 10 to 15 years often to get approval, and very, very expensive. You can argue about the numbers, but it's somewhere between $1 and $3 billion. And then it's relatively easy to copy, particularly for small molecules. Biologics are a little bit more complicated, but still, I can spend $3 billion, you could spend a few million or maybe 50 million to copy me and release something relatively cheaply. So if I can't protect that, then I have no incentive to spend that money and to take the time and resources to do it. So without IP, you really wouldn't have a biotech industry at all, or at least it would be much, much, much smaller.
And how do you feel about the current environment for IP writ large? When you're, either sitting at the desk or laying awake at night, what are you thinking about some of the changes we're talking about, or how is the health of IP more broadly in 2025?
I think the best word for it is complicated. We've had a decade plus where we've weakened IP rights in some pretty significant ways, and we're certainly seeing the impact of that. We're starting to switch that both at the PTO and potentially with legislation, but we're not entirely. And there's also some potentially negative legislation. So things are moving in multiple directions. And, as I like to say, we're pulling a lot of levers without necessarily thinking about what's going to happen when you pull that lever. And it doesn't always get to the results we want. So I think there is a need to kind of step back and say, okay, what's working, what we've done in the last decade, what's not working? I think there's a lot that's not working. And how do we actually fix those problems where they are rather than trying to make changes without necessarily knowing what we're doing? And I'm happy to go into some of the specifics on that as well.
Yeah, let's pull on that thread a little bit, maybe starting with what's not working from your view in the IP system, and are there legislative solutions out there that have caught your eye?
Yeah, so I think the three big issues that you can point to, and one has changed significantly in some ways in the last just couple of weeks, is patent eligibility, which is the first tier question. Is this the type of invention you can actually protect? Which was supposed to be pretty broad, pretty easy to get through. And then you look at the other parts of the statute to figure out, okay, it's the type of invention, but is it actually an invention? Is it new? Is it non-obvious? Is it enabled? There's the written description there, which are really supposed to do the meat of the work. A bit over a decade ago, the Supreme Court made a number of cases which expanded how you can use eligibility or narrowed eligibility, particularly in diagnostics from the life science side. And if you have a new molecule, you're still safe, but if you have a diagnostic, it's really tricky. And if you have software as part of your invention, it's also really tricky. I think that was a mistake. It's not based in the statute, not based in legislative history. And there is pending legislation, PARA, which would fix that. The other big legislation to restore injunctions. A patent is not a right to make or use or sell anything. It's a right to stop someone else from making or using or selling your invention. This is important because it does, help with licensing. You're not going to get someone to license and deal with you if they can just copy you without any consequences. Particularly in the biotech space, often, startups or small companies will take the invention through the first stages, and then they'll work with a bigger company to actually bring something to market. That works because the IP rights actually have some weight. If the big company could just steal your work and do it on their own, they're not going to make a deal. They're not going to spend $1 billion to buy a startup. And if anyone else can steal from them, then they're not going to spend the money anyway, because the second they release something, there'll be a cheap competitor out there and they're never going to make a return on investment. About 15 years ago, the Supreme Court had a case where in the concurrence, they dramatically narrowed the ability to get an injunction. Courts have interpreted that as being the law, and there's questions about whether that really should be the law, but it is now. So there's a piece of legislation which would fix that and bring back injunctions as being the standard if your patent is valid and infringed.
And is that is that the Restore Act?
That's Restore.
Okay.
The third biggest issue is PTAB, which is not really a big issue in the life science space at all. There are concerns from some about the use of it to make generics cheaper and bring them faster. But the evidence really doesn't support that. It's pretty narrow use in life sciences. There are some, but it's vastly more used more in tech. Uh, there's a piece of legislation which is designed to fix that and bring it back to what Congress intended, because there's been a bit too much variability administration to administration in terms of how it's been interpreted. So some administrations, it's very easy to get cases in front of the PTAB, some it's a bit harder. Right now, it's actually quite hard, and the PTAB has been narrowing quite a bit. So if you don't like the PTAB, you're pretty happy with what the PTO has done in the last few weeks. But the downside is the next administration couldn't flip it over entirely. So the benefit of having some legislation there is that we would set a bit more of a guideline as to what the PTO can do and have less variability year to year, which really matters for companies. When you think of, if I'm going to invest and build this, what is the chance of it going to be challenged, and is it actually worth something tomorrow? And you care if it's worth something today, but if it's not, if 5 years from now or 10 years from now when your drug releases, the system has changed and you don't know what the likelihood of the patent being worth something then it's very hard to make those long-term investments.
You said a lot. First of all, I think encapsulating those three different issues as you see as problems right now makes a lot of sense. So thank you, one, for distilling that down for us lay folks without the JDs and the practice and intellectual property. You said a few things that caught my ear, but one of them was the large company. A lot of times when I'm talking about IP on Capitol Hill, people think of it as a protection for the large manufacturer. But I think you raised an interesting point of the small biotechs need it too, because otherwise the large manufacturers could just create the innovation that they've had. And we see so much. We see 2/3 of the innovation in the system coming out of small biotechs. We talk a lot on this show that it's an ecosystem. It's not large versus small. And that's kind of what I'm hearing, is that IP is not just good for the big companies who have products on the market. From your view, IP is also critically important for the small biotechs and the emerging technologies.
Absolutely. IP is what lets deals happen, or certainly what helps deals happen, which is vital for this industry. And if you look at it, going back, all the way back to universities, which start for some of these, prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, universities could get protection, but they couldn't license, which meant university protections inventions stayed on the shelf because no one wanted to touch it because they couldn't protect it and couldn't make the deals. That changed. Universities could license, and we basically created the entire biotech ecosystem in the US based on that. Now, you could say that's universities versus small companies, but it's much the same thing, that if you can't protect it, then I don't want to talk to you because I'm afraid of what you'll do here. And there are trade secrets, but that doesn't really work in this space for a number of reasons, which we can get into. Mostly because if you're going to prove something works, you have to kind of show that it works, and people aren't going to trust you. It's like, take my drug. I'm not going to tell you how it works. I'm not going to show you any data, but it works. That doesn't really work in this space where it might work in others.
We have to bring the receipts, as the kids say. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't want to bury the lead here, because IP has been front and center the last couple weeks, couple months, thanks in large part to our Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. He has made some very outside the norm views about, from my perspective, on patents, and we've seen sort of an intrusion into the marketplace by the Trump administration that we typically haven't seen before. Have you been following Lutnick's various proposals as it relates to IP, and what do you make of them, to the extent there are details even out there?
Yeah, so I've been following them. I will say they're quite concerning, but the details are quite scarce. So certainly something we're watching, and certainly something I've written a little bit about and talked to some staffers about, but it's hard to comment too much on it without knowing what they're actually going to do. So I think the two proposals you're probably getting at are, one, to take half of the or 50% of the royalties for university patents. That one will probably kill most university licensing. And if you talk to Autumn, which is the Association of University Technology Managers, the vast majority of university patents have one potential licensee who they can make a deal with, because there's a lot of risk. It's early stage. You don't know if it's going to go anywhere. If you double the costs, which the university would likely do if you took half the revenue, then you're going to have fewer companies who want to take it, and a lot of things stay on the shelf. The other option is to say, well, universities can pay for this. And the answer is they can't. Most universities, tech transfer offices, lose money. They're not there to make money for universities. Some do make money. Some make a lot of money on occasion, but it usually is on an occasion. So if they lose half their revenues, how many universities who already have small offices, which are costing them something, are going to either have to people go or shut the offices entirely? Now, they have to have something as part of VADL, so they can't entirely shut it off. They can certainly cut back on it. So that, I think, would not really drive revenues for the government and would likely dramatically hurt the entire system. The other proposal is to take a 1% to 5% tax or fee or something on the value of patents. I think the idea behind that is that Secretary Lutnick thinks patents are valuable, which I think they are, and he feels the government is giving them to companies and that they should get a cut. And I have a couple of responses to that. First, anything the company does with the patent, whether they're licensing it or selling a product that covers the patent or making deals, that's taxable revenue. So we already get a good cut of it. We create lots of jobs. We pay people. Those are taxed. So I'm not seeing that on that side. Now, there were issues a number of years ago where companies could move IP rights to other countries and try to avoid some of the tax on that. And if that's the problem, I think there's ways to fix that without this. The other problem is valuing patents is actually really hard. As a former patent litigator, I can say it's common in cases, and there I'm not trying to figure out the value of the patent overall. I'm trying to figure out for one infringer, we could spend $100,000 on damages reports. Most patents are not worth $100,000. So anything that actually valued with any kind of reasonable way would probably cost more for most patents than you'd actually get as the 1% to 5%. So I don't see how you could do this, besides the fact that there's no legal way to do it, and we can get into the PTO's fee structures and why this can't be part of that. It doesn't seem like makes sense from a practical standpoint. Now, you could counter and say, if it's a single patent on a single drug, then you can figure out the sales. But again, you're getting taxes on the sales there. So I don't see what's missing.
There are two good points. The first one being a slice of this already is going back to the government in forms of taxes. And two, valuation of patents is probably a lot harder than we think. We will keep an eye out for, like you said, not a lot of details. We've seen the secretary kind of throw these ideas out there without a lot of guardrails or additional items that help us evaluate whether or not they're good proposals. But I think you've laid out a clear argument about some flaws with them. But I want to close in, we're saying it's a celebration of National IP Month, and America continues to innovate and in many places out-innovate the rest of the world. So what is working in IP, and what are some of the exciting sort of fruits of that labor that cross your desk? What keeps you excited and hopeful that we can continue to bring innovations that change people's lives?
Sure. So, I've talked a lot about the problems with the system, and I do think there are problems that things would be better if we fixed it. But overall, I'll say the system actually is working pretty well. On most reviews, one of the most innovative, if not the most innovative country still. I think, could we do better? And do we have concerns about competing with China and others as our system weakens and they're strengthened? Sure. But the biotech industry is a great example of what's working well in the US. We produce more new medicines than any other country. We approve more new medicines than any other country. The vast majority of new medicines come from us. So something is certainly working. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean we can't do better. We certainly can. But I think that those are things that you can take to heart. And even on tech, what we're doing with standard essential patents, with chip designs, we're doing pretty well in most of those areas. Again, is there competition that there wasn't 10 years ago? Yes. Do we have to be cautious? Yes. Can we do better? Yes. But I think we're still leading, and we should make sure to keep things going in the right direction and to fix the problems we've made rather than pushing things backwards and slowing things down, which we certainly can't afford to slow down at this point.
Well, I think, Will, I think that's a great place to leave it. We can't afford to slow down. There certainly are adversaries looking to out-innovate us. But like you said, I think our IP system is so foundational. It's worth celebrating, worth tweaking. There are improvements. And also there are some concerning proposals out there. So I'm so grateful that you took time away from IPPI to join us. So Joshua, thank you, and a very happy National IP Month to you.
Thank you, John.
That's all for this week's episode of the Making Medicine podcast. A special thanks to Joshua for joining to celebrate National IP Month with us. Do you have a thought or question about today's topics? Drop a comment and we'll feature it in next week's episode. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep innovating.